So, hauntings. Now, before hauntings,
About the
what
yeah, how to,
how to haunt? That's a whole separate series.
and I'll be patient. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
It's okay. Um, because my dad, that would be a great thing. He did have a how to around that one. But before we get to that point, um, there were the three phases of death that you mentioned. And I wanted to talk about, well, what is that like for a soul or a spirit
Mm,
as they're moving on? And for context, so because of my gifts and my abilities, I can see energy.
mhm,
And when people are going through their process and their soul is doing things, because this happens like when you are very much alive as well. Your soul is not just your mind, it doesn't just animate, but your soul has an existence beyond this incarnation. So I can tap into that existence. And that's where the psychic readings come from and come into play, but more in this death doula type of state. um, some people ask me what's going on with themselves or how they can navigate the process. Other ones are family members who
mhm.
want to know what's going on with mom, dad, friend, spouse. So I'd like to line up my experience with the three physical states of dying, and then we'll talk about the after. But the first one, you said the withdrawing, the mental, really the mental state or phase of your physicality, what's happening. During that phase, your soul, actually, I do need to clarify this too. A soul is energy.
Mhm,
So I realize we were talking in this first half of all the clinical stuff,
mhm,
scientifically proven. Now we're going into this state where people are like, but Andrea, prove
mhm.
it that it
Right.
exists. Well, the one thing that has been proven is that everything is energy.
Mhm,
That is truth. Your soul is energy,
mhm,
and it doesn't cease to exist. It moves.
mhm,
Now, whether you choose to believe the things that I say, where it goes afterwards, it's up to you. I'm not going to convince you for that. But during this first phase, during the mental withdrawing, your soul and your energy, which is very much grounded in earth, because this is where you are incarnated in your physical presence, the soul begins to detach.
mhm,
And what I notice is that the energy, which is usually super strong, like think of yourself as like the Empire State Building,
mhm,
steadfast, in place, immovable.
mhm,
All of a sudden, it's starting to let go. It's not going to fall over. It's not going to poof, magically vanish. But where right now, the Empire State Building, you can see it and it's super strong and you can touch it. The soul starts to go through this phase of withdrawal as well. The energy is no longer as strong and staunch and motivated for, I've got to do 100 things.
mhm,
If your soul is in that state of being, you're going to recover from whatever's happening to you physically.
mhm,
You're not going anywhere, even though it might feel or look like you are dying. You are not.
mhm,
The next phase, the not waking up or the discomfort, there are people who do recover
mhm,
from that state. They will come back for whatever time period they're going to still be alive on earth. But during that phase, usually the soul has now detached. The energy, the way I see it, is that whatever has been connected to earth, it begins to let go and it's in a hover state. So it can come back, it can
mhm,
leave,
mhm,
but the energy itself is transitioning now. So you as a soul, you are always in control actually of what is happening to your body. If you choose to stay, leave, whatever else, things don't happen randomly. That's a separate series or other
yeah,
conversation that we need to have. But for people who are like, this horrible accident happened. Yes and no
mhm,
with what's going on in someone's life. But in terms of death, your soul leaves when it's meant to leave,
mhm,
even if you were shot.
mhm,
So there are other things. This is where people are like, that's a miracle that they stayed.
mhm,
Yes,
mhm, mhm,
the soul still had stuff to do. They're still
mhm,
here for now. The last phase, the active dying phase. What's interesting is that at that point, the soul has let go. Now, physically, you might still be here. You
mhm,
might still be alive, but the soul and all of your energy has begun the transition to what I call the other side.
Mhm.
So when you're in that state of being, your consciousness is now, it's kind of like going in and out. Maybe let's call it training. You're
Mhm.
not ready to be over there yet. You're going through this process. You need to learn. Um, but it's back and forth, back and forth. It's kind of here in this plane of existence, but it's kind of already over there in that plane of existence. The physical body is quieting itself. So when I tap into people, I don't have to be physically present with somebody. I can feel their experience and I can psychically see what they
Mhm.
are going through. Usually, there is not this horrific, what you said, the death rattle, and even the soul feeling this like, oh my God, it hurts so bad. I, in my experience only,
Mhm.
I have not experienced that with anyone as they're crossing over. They are going through the process of what needs to take place.
Mhm.
And when you are in that final stage, that active death or dying, whether it's an hour or a few weeks, depending on what your body is actually doing, the more clear you become on the other side, the more you are transitioning into that state, to the point where if it is a very slow, drawn out process. I lost a friend last year in June, and she went from being totally fine to within 4 weeks being completely gone.
Mhm.
It was of cancer, but
Mhm.
the stages progressed very quickly. And the last 2 weeks, she was unconscious.
Mhm.
So I could talk to her, but the clearer the conversation started to become, the more I knew the
Mhm.
time was coming for her passing. And she went through what you described.
Mhm.
So there was no more food intake, no water. She was in bed. She slept 23 and a half hours a day
Mhm.
until it became 24 hours a day in the last few days. The hardest part, like her breathing started to slow, it would come up and it would go away for a while. Her heartbeat slowed down. The hardest part was for her mom and her husband.
Mm.
They were by her side through all of it.
Mhm.
And this is one of those things where she would have wanted that. She
Mhm.
was comfortable. That was her peaceful place with the
Mhm.
two of them. But that was her process. There
Mhm.
was no final gasp that was painful, and she just peacefully let go
Mhm.
in the end. So, a soul's transition, they're all different. It depends on what you're going through. And I'll share a few of those examples right now
Mhm.
because they are not all the same. And for
Mhm.
those people, you say this too, it ties into the Assholes Die Too series that we need to do, which really should be its own series itself. Because
We try to get people to click on that, but
I think everybody would click on that one. I'm like, what do they mean? Are they mean to
Mhm.
other people? Um, but what you have described around someone who has had a difficult life in one way or another. Maybe they were just horrible, mean people, or they were complete control freaks and they were like, I'm not dying, I'm not dying. And you're like, your body is literally given out. It's time to let go or say bye or make peace with life.
Mhm.
What happens with a soul in that state of being? It is fighting every step of the way. And what should be a very honestly seamless transition where it's everything that I just described, that is the most peaceful way. Like, death is happening. No matter if it's a sudden thing or something that is happening over a period of time,
Mhm.
your soul is in control and knows.
Mhm.
For people who are like, nothing exists on the other side, or I don't want to die, I'm going to live forever, which was my grandmother. I'm going to live forever. And we're like, that's not real.
Mhm.
Sorry, I don't know how to help you with this, but
Not a thing, but cool. Yeah.
exactly. I'm, fierce and a fighter till the very end.
Mhm.
Her death was so difficult.
Mhm.
None of us were there and
Mhm.
present for it. She was in a home, she was in assisted living. The only reason I know what she went through is because I tapped in and went through the process after I found out that she had passed away. I was like, well, what happened? How did this happen? What was going on? people always think like, oh, an angel comes to see you, or your loved ones come and get you, or whatever else. Your
Mhm.
spouse is the one that shows up. Yes, no, maybe. It's not the same
Depending
for
on the
everyone.
person. Mhm.
In her particular case, her parents showed up and she said no.
Mhm. Mm.
And I, I'm still in shock, obviously, over this whole process. She
Mhm.
respected her dad, and her mom was there, but in the background.
Mhm.
Her dad was like, arms outstretched, hands outstretched. I'm here. Like, you're not alone. We'll do
Yeah.
this together.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go.
Mhm.
She's like, no, thank you.
Hard no.
Bye. So physically, the person who was next to her in the room that they were sharing was hearing certain things
Mhm.
about her, like through her death process. She was talking out
Mhm.
loud and it was gibberish. I found this out way after the fact, way after I did the psychic kind of touch
Mhm.
base with her. She didn't immediately cross over.
Mm-mm.
There's definitely a tie between your mental state
Mhm.
and your ability to know that death is part of life and I don't need to be afraid
Right.
because, every person who's ever lived has died
Mhm.
and they will. But for those who are so afraid of it, seek help, talk to your doctor, work with your nurses,
Mhm.
whoever, and have the conversation. If you don't want to talk to family about it, but ask questions because living forever isn't an option right now. And for her, what it looked like, she actually went into this holding place.
Mhm.
No, it's not limbo. It's not.
Yeah. Purgatory.
Thank you. I was like, Kath, I haven't been Catholic in so
I got
long.
you.
Thank you. Purgatory. It wasn't that. And it wasn't a bright light. So what I saw for her is that she moved into this place that was kind of like a forest in
Mhm.
front of her. It was twilight. It was dark blue and light blue, but there wasn't light.
Mhm.
And she was very much alone when she was there. And this part after she passed between her funeral, so passing to funeral and then afterwards, she was very present at her funeral.
Mhm.
But after that, there was a bridge into this forest. And finally, like I talked to her a little bit too, and it was like, you can move on. It's okay. And you get through that, and it will be wonderful for you. You will be at peace.
Mhm.
Don't torture yourself by holding on to a life that no longer exists.
Yeah.
Here, your body said goodbye.
Mhm.
Your soul is ready to go on to the next thing.
Right.
So she did cross she crossed this bridge, went into this forest, and then all of a sudden, everything, the angst, like I can feel it right now, her anxiety around, no, 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 I don't want to die. It eased.
Yeah.
She let go.
Mhm.
Um, it fast forward to my dad's passing. At one point, I talked to my dad a few times, but at one point, there's this place called the Hall of Records. So anything that has ever existed, people who've existed, all existence across the universe is blah, blah, blah. It's like a ginormous library, is the
Mhm.
easiest way to put it with Roman columns or Greek columns.
Mhm.
Anyway, my grandfather, when he passed in 1989, when I first visited him on the other side to make sure he was okay, he
Mhm.
was in the Hall of Records with a book open and he was writing. His entire life, he was a researcher here. And that's what his soul is. He's always studying and learning and absorbing. So fast forward, what, 30, almost 40 years, he's still doing that there.
Mhm.
With my dad, I was walking past the Hall of Records and we were talking, and he just nodded over to my grandfather. And I looked up and I saw my grandmother
Mhm.
standing behind him. They had an interesting marriage here,
Yeah.
and he was a very quiet man
Mhm.
and very to himself, didn't like, not passionate, nothing. He was very just quiet and internal the whole
Mhm.
time. My grandmother was there behind him going like yelling at him, and he was just still writing. And my dad looked at me and he was like, let's go. So this is all happening in heaven.
Mhm.
All of them have crossed over. They are all completely fine. And no, my grandmother is not still doing that to my grandfather. I just happened to catch a moment that my
Mhm.
dad had seen and he wanted to share with me because
Mhm.
he thought it was funny.
Yeah.
Um, but life energy moves on. Energy is not destroyed.
Mhm.
So your process of death and what your soul is going through when you are in your physical state,
Mhm.
it's just what you said about your body. Your body knows what it's doing.
Mhm.
It's going through something that is very natural.
Mhm.
Your soul is doing the same thing,
Mhm.
especially if you are facing a natural death. Your
Mhm.
soul has had time to go through the, okay, I get it. It's ready to move on. It's more the mind, the human mind, and the human experiences. For some people, there's a disconnect between your soul state and then your mental state and then your emotional state. And when all of those are disconnected, that's where we have problems of hauntings or other things where you're hanging out in a place and they don't let go for one reason or another. I will say, not one soul that's crossed over that I've been asked to connect with has ever said, honey, there's a treasure that's buried over here, or don't give away my pearl earrings. Nobody cares.
Mhm.
The material state does not matter. It ceases to exist when you leave here.
Mhm.
So for anyone who's like, Andrea, do reading for me, and I want to know, like, do they know that I put the diamond necklace into blood? They honestly do not care. The
Mhm.
one thing that is universally true with every person who's crossed over that I've done a reading with, because what I'm speaking with them
Yeah.
and speaking with the person who's here.
Mhm.
In those conversations, the one thing that is universally true 100% of the time has
Mhm.
been tell the person who's alive, I love them.
Mhm. Mhm.
100% of the time, every single time.
Mhm.
And then usually the person who's alive is asking me to validate, like, give me a sign. What are
Okay.
they telling me? What do I
Yeah.
need to look for them?
Yeah.
And usually I get an eye roll from the other
Mhm.
side because
Yeah.
it's this, okay, there's this symbol or this symbol that they would know or whatever. And yes, they will get those signs. The problem is that the majority of the time,
Mhm.
death is far more traumatic for the people who are here than the person who's moved on.
Mhm.
And when I have people who, I mean, death is, it is traumatic in its own way.
Mhm.
But for the people who remain behind, who are alive, who stop living because of the death that they experienced of their loved one,
Mhm.
and they keep asking for more signs and more signs and they can't let go. I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend anyone and I don't want to hurt your feelings out there. Please, please seek out a bereavement counselor who
Mhm.
can help you process grief and
Mhm.
death. And if you need a therapist, there's nothing wrong with finding a therapist that you
Mhm.
can speak to about all of your feelings and not have to filter out what you're thinking or what you're going through. But what you're experiencing is far worse, and you are now torturing yourself
Mhm.
when your loved one has moved on and they have found peace.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
is rare, so incredibly rare to have someone not cross over
Mhm.
and to be haunting here. Most of the time, when people do cross over, if they come back and give signs for their loved ones, they are not stuck in this plane.
Mhm.
They will give you a sign because they want you to know that they're still with you,
Yeah.
but they are quite happy where they are. And there's
Mhm.
no physical pain or emotional pain or any of the pain that humans experience. None of that exists on the other side. They're
Mhm.
perfectly at peace.
Mm.
I know that's throwing a lot in there, and it's a very different conversation than
Love it.
clinical
Yeah. No, I
to
think
this.
I love it. I think the thing that I take away from that, there's a couple of things that you said where I thought that's fascinating, right? Because it ties into that people who don't like when I say assholes day too, I say it because it's funny and I say it because it kind of shocks people, but I also say it because it's true. In that, like, I think it makes people think the greater situation of their death is going to be poor, right? Like they're not going to have the people they love around them, which might be true. But what I really mean is that physical sense of staying and no, I don't want to do that. And part of it I've really experienced is people who had death in their life and never dealt with it validated the scary, unknown fear of it, where it becomes this no, no, under any circumstance, under the circumstance of looking my own people in the eyes and not trusting them enough to go with them. That's how what I did to myself by not dealing with the death and the grief in my life is
Mhm.
I made the assumption that nothing could be worse than death. And there's nobody who does healthcare for sure. And there's plenty of people who don't even do healthcare, but have just seen people go through long, hard processes who wouldn't tell you there are definitely things worse than death in life, right? Like the example of the 90-year-old who doesn't know where they are and lives in this state of I've been left here. That to me is much worse than anything I've ever seen death be. Right.
Exactly. Death
Yeah.
brings peace.
Hmm.
Yes, it's a process that we have to go through. And the scary part is we don't know how it's going to happen to us. We
Right.
don't want to feel the pain. I think that's universal for the most part. Again, if
Mhm.
you're one of the ones who wants to feel pain, I can't help you
You're
there.
not your this is not your church, your chat.
Yeah, exactly. That's not in this series. But it's that death process and holding on and why you're holding on, why you won't let go. That does need to be handled and does need to be talked about. And going back to what you were saying earlier about religion,
Yeah.
my grandmother's religious beliefs, because she was Catholic, she did things in her life
Mhm,
that were not approved by the church, shall we say.
mhm.
So she was very much afraid of facing whatever was on the other side.
Yeah. The penance gonna be too high, yeah.
It's
Mhm,
exactly, and she's not the only one. I can say that because I've experienced other people too who, for their religious beliefs,
mhm,
are afraid of facing the reckoning that God or Jesus is waiting on the other side, and you're going to be like, or Archangel Michael is going to say, "Here are the pearly gates,"
mhm. Those are not for
or
you.
"You broke X commandment, so you have to take the exit or take the stairs down."
Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm,
never. 100% of the souls that I've talked to, not one of them went through that experience.
mhm,
Not one. Hell, the way people thinks it exists, does
mhm,
not.
mhm,
The hell that we create in this lifetime
mhm.
is repeated in other lifetimes to come, and that's not for maybe even this series, although it could be if we want to talk about reincarnation.
Right, right,
It's a
right.
fun topic to get
Mhm.
into.
I love it.
But if we want to talk about hauntings for a second, my dad, this
Yes.
is the fun thing. Like, people always ask questions.
Threaten to haunt my kids all the time, and if I'm honest, I don't know how I will do it, but I want to, just a little,
We'll do a
right?
how-to. Quick of
Okay.
that one. The I mean, it starts really easy. Once you cross over,
Mhm.
make sure you're good on the other side. Give
Yeah.
yourself a break, catch
Mhm.
up
Take
with
a minute.
loved ones, because then you can hop back in and out. Your energy will build up on the other side. You have to get through the transition. There is one thing I want to clarify. That transition phase looks different for everybody. There's one soul that I met who transitioned instantly.
Mm,
She went through her sickness and death, but even once her physical body died, she was like ready to go on the
mhm.
other side. That's
Mm,
rare.
yeah.
Normally it's a few days of your soul being like, did I die?
Mhm,
It's real. I'm okay. And
mhm,
you're getting used to this idea. So that takes a couple days. In my
mhm,
grandmother's case and in my cousin's case, which is a story for another episode,
mhm,
it took them a few weeks of
mm,
our time
yeah.
for them to fully cross over and allow their souls to go through what they needed to go through.
Mm,
And they both had stuff that they did not deal with in this life that created that reality for them when they moved over. The how to, um, certainly it's what I just shared. Make sure you've crossed over and you're totally fine. And then you can hop in and out whatever you want because you've got the energy to do so. My
mhm,
dad.
mhm,
My dad was curious about the supernatural, and so because of my abilities, every home I've ever lived in,
mhm,
things find me.
yeah.
Now, sometimes my family members experience those things with me.
Mhm.
It's terrifying for people who don't want to deal with it,
Mhm,
or it's just too scary, whatever it is. Um, but my dad specifically, I would say things to him and he'd be like, "Oh, come on." Like,
Mhm,
"No, that's not true," or it is. Like, it depended on what was being told to him and what threshold he could handle.
mhm.
But the really scary stuff, he was like, "Just stop talking, stop talking, stop talking. I don't want to deal with it."
Yeah.
He had this story that when he went to visit his sister in Hungary,
Mhm,
lives in a house where her father-in-law committed suicide. I
mm,
visited this house when I was a little kid,
mhm,
and my sister and I saw it wasn't just one ghost. Like,
mhm,
there were presences multiple and not good. Like, you
mhm,
can feel the difference between an angel and something that is evil.
mhm,
So this house had other things.
mhm,
Um, Anywho, my dad went back years, like decades after that moment. And he stayed at this house and he was awoken in the middle of the night to fingernails scratching underneath his pillow. So they were
mhm,
scratching the bed under his
mhm.
pillow. And I mean, scared the shit out of him.
Wouldn't
It
it?
just
Yeah.
like, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And he said it, he said his prayers. There's a prayer for the dead that we say in Hungarian that he taught me when I was a little kid. Uh,
Mhm,
but he did all of this and prayed to God, like, oh, please protect me and my angels and all that. But he shared this story with me.
mhm.
And I think I laughed at him, honestly, because I was like, you don't believe the stuff I tell you.
Yeah.
Here you go. You experienced it, right? He
Mhm.
was like, I'm coming back for you.
Oh,
Coming
no.
back and I'm going to scare the crap out of you. And he did. So he
Mhm,
did a few things after he passed, and it wasn't immediately afterwards. Um, but at first, it was this popping in where I could feel him. Like,
mhm,
if you think of your loved ones,
mhm,
your children have a certain vibe or energy. You can be cooking in the kitchen or whatever, and your son can walk in, or one of your daughters.
mhm,
Most likely, you know which one it is outside of the noise that they're making,
mhm.
right? But you can feel that energy with them. Well, the same thing is true when someone crosses over.
Yeah.
Personality doesn't entirely change. Your soul is what it is for the most part. That's
Mhm.
another separate episode, but like for the most part. So my dad, I could feel him in my room.
Yeah.
And I was like, thank you for coming. I know you're okay. I miss
Mhm,
you. I love you.
mhm.
Another time he touched my foot and I was like, dude, I know what you said,
I don't
but
think
you
so.
also know all the other spirits that I deal with.
Yeah.
That's not funny to me.
Mhm.
Um, the last one was I woke up in the middle of the night, two nails scratching under my pillow.
I
No
love
one
it.
else knew that story
Yeah.
outside of my mom, probably.
Mhm. Yeah.
I knew that was him. And at first, I woke up and I was terrified. And then I was like, but there's nothing evil around me. I'm like, Dad, are you
Mhm.
serious? He has not shown up since then. Like, we have dream state conversations, psychic conversations. Like, I can talk to him whenever I want to, but
Yeah.
physically,
Mhm.
that was the last one. He made good on his promise.
I love that. And I appreciate the how to. I think, for me, I have no basis of like the existential or the supernatural or the psychic side other than my own experiences, but certainly it's not something that I've ever really um pursued, and when my own dad died, like I had this immediate sense of knowing he was fine, like just confident in that sense, but it didn't really help with the grief, right? Like people would always my least we talked about this, my least favorite thing is he's in a better place. Like I would like him here and grumpy just how I like him, right? Like I don't care if he's happy, I'm pissed that he's gone, is my approach to that. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, like, the energy piece of it, like, my only other experience in this kind of, medium or psychic world is literally television, right? Like, one time, gosh, it was probably 4 or 5 years after my dad died, we went to Teresa Caputo Live, like that Long Island medium lady,
Oh,
just
yeah.
with friends for fun, right? And everybody was like, "Oh, I hope to see this," and I was like, "I don't really like, I don't feel like I need that." I feel like I don't really hear my dad back, but I feel like I talk to him all the time, and I don't Like, I don't feel like I think every time I see that show or I see those people, I see people who are desperate for validation and confirmation of like, please, I can't take another deep breath until someone tells me they're okay. And I've never felt that. So I don't really, other than just like entertainment wise, have a lot. But when you talk about the energy piece of a soul, it really resonates as a mom, having 3 kids, like I don't need to turn around to know which one of them is in the room. And I think that is an energy piece, and I had never thought about it in the way that you talk about, like, a soul and in that process and when they're grounded and but it makes so much sense. One thing that I do say to people, and I said this actually to my own sister when my mom passed away, which was just recently, it was last August, and, you can feel it, right? Like, and you don't have to have, for me, I knew my mom would not want me there in that moment. And she would not want me to see her body anything other than presented because she liked to
Mhm.
present herself. Like she wanted everything to look good. And she wouldn't want anyone to have that memory of her. This
Yeah.
I just know about my mom. And we talked about it, right? And so my sister came just as she was dying and like had that perfect moment of my mom knew how desperately my sister needed to not miss it, right? And so she didn't let her miss it, but she just barely made it, right? So she was coming in from out of town. She came and um I knew she was close. And my sister comes out and I told her, she was like, I'm going back in. And I was like, you need to ask yourself first, do you want that memory? And what do you want to see? Like if she's alive, are you good with going back in? But if she's not, do you want to see that? She's like, I don't want to, I know she wouldn't want me to. And I was like, okay. So she was snoring, not rattling, but you could hear her, and so she was like, I'm going back in. And she had already kind of made her peace and stepped out. And I was like, okay, do me a favor before you go in and stop because you had to kind of go down a hall and listen. And if you don't hear anything, then, make a choice. Either turn around and we'll send the nurse in, who was not me, obviously, or, whatever it is. And so she went back in and she came right back out and she's like, I don't hear anything. So we both went to the door and I was like, that's an empty room. Right. And it was just her in there. And I stood there in this hall with my sister and I said, do you feel that? Like it feels like we're standing outside of an empty room.
Mhm.
And she looked at me and like, I've always thought this as a nurse doing what I do, where I'm like, if someone's like, I think they're gone, I know before I see them, once I open the door, whether or not because it feels like an empty room.
Empty.
And it doesn't feel that way until it is that way. You
Mhm.
can feel the energy of it. And I had never put it in that context until you said that, but have this very vivid memory of standing there with my sister and saying, ooh, I feel it. Like that's an empty room. And she looked at me and she's like, you're right. It does feel empty. And I was like, because it is. All that's left in there is a body, not a person. Like, and then I was like, I'm not going in there. You can go if you want. She's like, I don't want to, but like you go get the nurse and she was gone. Right. And it was, and I've said that and felt that. Usually I say it to other nurses when I'm training them to how do you deal with that? And like, how do you sit in a room with a body in it? And, how do you see a dead body? Those kind of things come up a lot. And I'm like, that comes from a lifetime of having a dad who came from a line of morticians where it's like a body's a body, like, it's not a person, right? And I like my husband thinks it's crazy or thought initially because my dad is buried in Nebraska and we live in Colorado. And he's like, well, don't you need to go see him at the cemetery? And I was like, I mean, I'll go to the cemetery, but I don't feel him there. I don't
Exactly.
need to go there to feel him. That is where his body's buried. So like I'll make sure it's cleaned off and I'll I care about that space because it's sentimental, but it's not him to me.
Exactly.
And the energy, I realize when you call it that, is that piece where it's like it's an empty room. There's nothing in it. Even though a body is in there, a person is not. And it's very defined. And I think I mean, I know I've worked with nurses across all levels of religion and ideology and all of those types of things, but there's nobody that I know of who wouldn't understand what I mean, the feeling. And I think that's where people are like, it's creepy in here because it looks like there should be another person and you're alone. And so you have that feeling of being alone, even though you see a person. And my weird brain was always like, well, that's not a person, that's a body. Like, it's an empty room. So I love how you put that. It's kind of blowing my mind a little bit.
Well, and I'm glad that you said that because the energy and the emptiness for
Mhm,
everyone who's terrified of a haunting or a ghost showing up and they're blocking their loved ones from coming back and saying hi because you're afraid of it. It literally feels like what you just described. If you are alone in a room, you know what that feels like. It's
mhm,
you and
right,
there's no other energy around you.
mhm,
Contrast that with I'm physically alone in a room, but I
mhm,
can feel someone else in there. And it doesn't have to be a ghost. I mean, like a husband,
right.
family member, or whatever. What does that feel like? So, conscientiously or
Mhm,
consciously right now, like take a look at what that feels like.
mhm,
And one day, should someone pass that's very close to you,
mhm.
you don't need to be afraid. You don't get these freezing for everyone who does ghost hunting. And I could do an entire series about why
I'm
people
curious
are
about that. I could
torturing
see the vibe.
ghosts
Yeah.
because they're doing awful things and not helping people cross over with that stuff. But are you going to feel ice cold air around you? Well, only if it's a ghost that's really stuck here and they want your attention and
Mhm,
they're literally pulling energy out of your room or out of your space, then you will feel that and it feels bad. If it
mhm,
is your loved one showing up,
yeah,
you're not going to feel that. You actually feel warmth.
mhm,
Energy is warm because it is love, and
mhm,
loving energy is
yeah,
nothing to be afraid of. Your family is coming back to say hi.
mhm,
Someone called it a wink once,
yeah,
like a ghost wink. I love that idea
yeah,
because that's what it is. It's someone just being like, I miss you, I love you, quick hug,
mhm,
bye. That is a beautiful thing. But how you described an empty room,
mhm,
yes. And for everyone who wants me to always extra validate, well, how do you know? How do you know it's that? it's it's energy. You can feel energy, and you know what an empty room feels like, and you know when you are surrounded by 30 not living human beings
mhm.
because they all want to talk to you and they all want to say something else. It feels like you were in a crowded room and no one is respecting your personal space.
Right. Yeah, that would be crazy. Yeah. I love that piece, right? Like the just, I'm certainly not a skeptic of things like the psychic piece or the communicating with. I'm just I almost would call myself ambivalent, which sounds silly, but like it just feels so hypothetical to me and beyond where my brain thinks. But then you say something like that, and I'm like, actually, that's exactly how my brain thinks. I just don't call it those things because it is just that moment of, and that's how I tell people when their person has died and they're like, I have to sit here and stare at this body for 3 hours, even though, or if they've died and they've missed it, I've got to go say goodbye. Do you? Are you insisting to me right now that you own a memory we both know you don't want, so you can go profess love the person knew you already had to a body that no longer holds anything? You sure about that? Like, you don't have to have this memory. I promise I will stay, or whatever it needs to be for that person, but that I've got to get there and say goodbye, just say it. They're there, right? Like the energy is there. Um, but I've never had the words for it like that as far as like the soul piece. For me, it is just like we can, why are you sitting in this room you hate being in, feeling that discomfort? It really is that discomfort of I feel alone in this room and I see a person, so what I feel and what I see don't match.
Yeah,
Whether that's I see nobody and I feel people, or I see people and I feel nobody, both of those are uncomfortable. And it gives that vibe of a ghost. And I think that's why people are like, ooh, a dead body. And I'm like, well, I mean, yes and no. Depends on how much you're willing to think about it. And I think that's the thing is as soon as it gets uncomfortable, life, death, afterlife, all of that stuff, as soon as we feel uncomfortable, we stop thinking about it. We don't get very inquisitive. We shut it down and we're like, nope, not thinking about that anymore. You
exactly.
know?
Well, it's so scary to think
Mhm.
about and to think about the what ifs. And then, because then the what ifs might have scary answers too. And the reality is that very few things have scary answers.
Right.
It's that we can do some research, we can figure it out. Is death something to be afraid of? in my opinion and my experience, no. What we're
Mhm.
going through here on earth and these human lives that we have, it is filled with so much stress, so much chaos, and yes, celebration and wonderful moments too.
Mhm.
But at the end of your life, for however long you are alive, right? Not
Mhm.
everyone hits 100.
Mhm.
But during that time, the biggest thing is live your life to the fullest. Don't wait to say I love you so that you need to say I love you to a body that no longer contains a soul or
Mhm.
energy in
Mhm.
it, because that person probably would have valued it more while they were alive.
Mhm.
And you can say it from any place on this planet. If you can't get to a funeral, you can't go to a viewing, you can't be present for something, there is, you can speak to that soul, that person,
Mhm.
anywhere, anytime. They will always be present for you. And don't wait for a sign to come through.
Mhm.
Just speak. You can have a conversation with them. It's
Mhm.
okay.
Right. Well, and believe yourself, right? Like
Yes.
partially my unnecessary amount of confidence in the things that I think, which gets me in trouble sometimes, is part of what I think helps me through my grief too, is like when I think I feel like they're okay, I'm willing to believe myself. And I think a lot of people, if they would try to feel it versus want it on paper and want a note that
Mhm.
promises it, if they would trust themselves or even try, could probably feel more than they give themselves credit for. Because I'm as far from anybody who would call me connected to that as possible. But I'm also someone who's like, well, I mean, I don't feel uncomfortable about it. So I think it's okay. And that comes from a weird life with a lot of death in it, like it's not going to be everyone's experience. But I think that's part of what we skip too is when it's uncomfortable or when we're not sure, we want facts. And this is not an area of life that contains a lot of facts. And
Mhm.
if we can't have them, we want to ignore. And where we're at right now in life is like it's easier than it ever has been on this planet to stop thinking. Right? You can occupy your mind in a way that's never existed before. Like you couldn't scroll on TikTok in the 1800s when your person died. So you couldn't turn your thought processes off and keep yourself entertained. And you can now. And so we're getting better and better at, I don't want to think about that. And so I'm not going to. And I really can make it never happen. Right? Like I can never face it and keep my mind occupied with things that make me feel good. And then all of a sudden, here I am. I'm really curious and terrified about what it'll look like when this generation of like, the 40 and 50-year-olds who's always had that ability start to turn 60, 70, 80 and have these expected deaths and have had the ability to not process or think in more than 15-second clips or big chunks of their lives. Like it's going to be a trip, you know?
As you're saying that, I'm like, our generation, when
Mhm.
we are there, I
Yeah.
mean, we were talking before we started recording of our children.
Yes.
My child who speaks in grunts and
Yeah.
noises
Well,
and not full sentences is going to be, and his generation,
Mhm.
that's the TikTok generation, Snapchat, and
Yes.
yes,
Yeah.
ADHD constantly, right? With everything and the art of distraction,
Yes.
right? They're responsible for for Gen X's and the
Mhm.
millennials' health and well being. That is terrifying.
I think we just went down a rabbit hole. I think I'm gonna need to scroll for a little bit to forget that that is so true. It hurts my feelings a little bit. Oh no. I
Maybe they'll watch our videos
No, they
and we'll
won't.
be
Our
able to
videos are
influence
so
them.
long. They're not watching this. Oh no. You know, like
Out of our
they
videos, I
won't
mean, how
even read a
many?
long blog post. If it's 2 paragraphs, they are out. We are so
That's
screwed.
right. Well, they don't scroll and they
No.
don't like human interaction either.
And they don't have to have it, like whenever you feel uncomfortable, you can avoid it in a way we never been able to before.
Exactly.
Worse. And I think I prefer what I usually think about when I think about like our generation getting older is how funny it will be what brings comfort in like a memory care right now or a you know, an assisted living is like I'll walk in and the Andy Griffith show is always on, and in the background it's like WAP and stuff, and you're like, this is jazzy. And so I always like to think like, you know, in 50 years when we're all there, is it going to be like, you know, Biggie on the radio and like the voice reruns of The Bachelor on, and everyone's gonna be Dancing with the Stars. So like it'll look so different, right? Like, because you can put on a song and change a whole person's demeanor right now, but it's like a legitimately old song, right? You're like, let me see if this is even on Apple Music. So it'll be hilarious if somebody comes in one day and is like, she, you know, let's see how she feels about the Beastie Boys. What is that going to do for her mood today?
Kate, I
That's much
can't
more of
wait.
a hilarious thought than thinking this whole generation below us is going to be the ones who have to make these choices for us. Can't DoorDash this one.
I will lose my mind if all we're going to be watching are TikToks of cars, because that would be what my son shares with us.
Fair point.
But yeah, right now, maybe we end on this note.
Yes.
Currently, the oldies station, at least when I went back home last year, the oldies station was playing 80s and 90s music.
You're up to the
That made
2000s.
me very sad. Very sad. I'm like, no, no, oldies is 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Please.
No, no. Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow. The first time like the oldies station played, like I even remember hearing like Bon Jovi and stuff on it and being like, whoa, 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 whoa. Why
It was
is
Nirvana.
yeah, and now you're hearing like Nirvana and all the things that are very hip and relevant. We must have
Uh,
changed what these mean.
what was that?
It must have changed what it means to be an oldie station, I think. It's not,
Exactly.
yeah.
Eternally youthful.
I like it. That's the perfect note to end on.
Yes, I
Our
love that.
own avoidance.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate this. I can't wait for us to do this again.
Love it. Yes, anytime.